Forget the myth of the clumsy caveman. The old story is familiar. A hunter leaves wild berries in a clay bowl. The fruit rots in the sun. He drinks the cloudy juice and accidentally invents a party. It is a comforting fairy tale. It makes history look like a series of happy accidents. The chemical evidence tells a much darker, calculated story. 9,000 years ago, humans did not stumble upon alcohol. They engineered it deliberately. And in doing so, they broke the absolute, non-negotiable law of the Stone Age. Do not waste calories. Every grain of starch stood between a tribe and starvation. Yet the earliest farmers took their most precious carbohydrates and willfully destroyed their nutritional value. Let us examine the primary site. The village is called Jiahu. It sits in the Henan province of China. The timeline is roughly 7,000 to 6,600 BC, the dawn of the Neolithic era. People here are just figuring out the grueling mechanics of agriculture. They live in tight communities. They carve flutes out of red-crowned crane bones. They fire rudimentary pottery, and they leave broken things behind in the dirt. Fast forward to the early 2000s. Biomolecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern gets his hands on some shards from these ancient pots. He runs the organic residues through modern mass spectrometry. He analyzes the chemical markers left behind in the ancient clay. Ethanol does not survive 9 millennia. It is highly volatile. Soil microorganisms eat it up almost immediately. You cannot just extract a drop of prehistoric liquid and measure the proof. You have to look for the chemical markers left behind in the porous walls. McGovern's team published their findings in PNAS. The data was stunning. They found tartaric acid. That points directly to wild grapes or hawthorn fruit. They found specific beeswax compounds. That confirms the presence of raw honey. And they found phytosterol ferulate esters, the unmistakable chemical signature of rice. This was no simple fermented mush. The records show a highly complex hybrid. McGovern famously labeled it an extreme fermented beverage. Rather than brewing separate batches of rice beer or fruit wine, the people of Jiahu combined these substrates into a single vessel. The Guinness World Records officially recognizes this concoction as the oldest chemically confirmed complex alcoholic beverage in human history. The modern bar begins right here in the Neolithic mud. What did this concoction actually taste like? Forget a crisp modern lager. Think thick, unfiltered. The organoleptic profile reconstructed from these markers suggests a heavy hybrid between a rustic rice wine and a fruity mead. It carried a sweet-sour punch. It tasted of earth, wild yeast, and unglazed clay. The alcohol by volume sat somewhere around 3 to 6%, roughly the strength of a modern light beer. The brewery Dogfish Head even tried to recreate it. They called the project Chateau Jiahu. They used muscat grapes and rice syrup. They fermented it with modern sake yeast. Here is the central contradiction. The Jiahu caloric paradox. Think about the physical labor involved. Harvesting early domesticated rice is brutal work. You stand knee-deep in marshland. You thresh the stalks by hand. Rice is pure life-saving energy. It keeps the tribe breathing through the harsh winter months. Now consider the honey. Honey in the Neolithic era is not neatly packaged. It is heavily guarded by swarms high in the trees. Why endure severe physical risk and pain just to gather this rare, hyper-dense caloric treasure? So what do these struggling farmers do with their premium survival rations? They dump them into a vat. They add water. They let wild yeast eat the sugars. The yeast excretes carbon dioxide and ethanol. From a pure survival standpoint, this is sheer lunacy. The fermentation process literally burns off the calories. A significant portion of the energy value vanishes into the air as gas. The metabolic conversion prioritizes intoxication over caloric preservation. The biology complicates things further. Rice does not just ferment on its own. Grapes have sugar and wild yeast right on their skins. Left alone, they can easily rot into a crude wine. Grains are different. Grain is locked starch. Yeast cannot eat starch. A biological key is required to break that complex carbohydrate down into simple sugars. That enzyme is called amylase. Where do you find amylase in a Neolithic village? In human saliva. The most ancient biotechnology known to our species is chewing. The entire community likely sat around masticating raw rice and spitting the pulp into the communal pots. The spit acted as the chemical trigger. It unlocked the starches. The honey acted as the high-sugar catalyst to kickstart the wild yeast. The hawthorn provided the necessary acid balance to keep harmful bacteria at bay. This completely eliminates any theory of an accident. Chewing a massive harvest of rice and blending it with dangerously procured honey required an intentional, highly managed recipe. They intentionally managed the recipe, matching the temperatures and acid levels perfectly to blend chewed rice with procured honey. The evidence shows this was a specific cultural choice. Look further south in China, another archaeological site called Jiahu, roughly 9,000 years old. They also brewed early alcohol on a large platform mound, but their pots show a completely different recipe. Rice, Job's tears, and tubers, a pure starch beer. The researchers note that the Jiahu cocktail was utterly unique to its people. They demanded that exact chemical reaction. The data forces us to reevaluate everything about these early settlers. Anthropologists heavily debate the beer before bread theory. This supports the anthropological theory that the pursuit of fermentation rather than baking bread was the primary driver for early agricultural settlement. But it still leaves a gaping hole in the ledger. You do not expend this much energy just to catch a buzz on a random Tuesday. The cost of production was astronomical. The drain on physical reserves was massive. This cloudy, spit-fermented mash was not a casual refreshment. It held a value that completely superseded the biological need to eat. Who exactly was the true buyer of this astronomically expensive, spit-fermented liquid currency? Finding that buyer requires examining the crime scene of the manufacturing process. The Jiahu cocktail required aggressive intervention. You cannot leave a basket of harvested rice in a damp clay pot and expect a 3% narcotic. The energy in raw rice remains locked away as complex carbohydrates. Wild yeast strains are highly specialized scavengers. They seek out simple sugars to consume and excrete as ethanol. Starch offers them zero sustenance. The raw grain simply rots. The Neolithic brewers confronted a severe biological barrier. They needed a chemical key to unlock the grain's energy matrix. The solution existed exclusively inside their own heads. Human saliva carries a specific payload. It contains ptyalin. This is an amylase enzyme evolved specifically to hydrolyze starch down into maltose and other fermentable sugars. Thus, the clay brewing vat operated as an external stomach, deploying ptyalin to hydrolyze the raw starch. Generating enough pre-digested sugar for a tribal supply demanded total physical mobilization. Dozens of individuals sat around the earthen vats for hours. They rhythmically chewed raw grains, roots, or wild berries. They held the dense mash in their mouths. The community waited for the enzymes to initiate the molecular breakdown. The masticated pulp was then spat directly into the collective pool. The initial stage of fermentation relied directly on human mastication. The sheer physical reality of this process strips away the romance of ancient agriculture. The brewers deployed their own biology to force the chemical reaction. The stakes were astronomical. A tribe gambled its winter survival against starvation on the collective saliva of its members. If the enzyme failed, the harvest spoiled. The village starved. We know this exact biochemical mechanism survived intact across millennia. The instructions were eventually written down. The brewers disguised the manual as theology. The Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson preserved the older Norse pantheon in the 13th century Prose Edda. The text details a brutal, gridlocked cosmic war between two factions of deities. The Aesir and the Vanir fought until both sides faced total exhaustion. They negotiated a permanent truce. The gods sealed the peace pact without exchanging hostages or carving runes. The leaders gathered around a single wooden vat. They spat into the vessel. This act signifies the ultimate dissolution of tribal boundaries. Does spitting into a single wooden vat signify the absolute necessity of the entire collective's biological contribution? From that mingled divine saliva, a living entity materialized. His name was Kvasir. The texts describe him as the wisest being in existence. He operated as a wandering scholar. He traversed the 9 realms to dispense absolute truth. This roaming period perfectly mirrors the necessary resting phase of the mash. The crushed, masticated pulp must sit exposed to the open air, allowing environmental yeast to colonize the mixture. Kvasir's roaming eventually brought him to the subterranean realm of 2 dwarfs. Fjalar and Galar had zero interest in his lectures on cosmic balance. They murdered him. Dwarfs in Norse mythology function as master craftsmen and processors of raw materials. They act as the allegorical brewers. The dwarfs dragged the scholar's corpse into their deep forge. They pressed him. They bled the entity dry. The crimson fluid flowed into 3 distinct containers. The vats sewn in Bothen received the bulk of the yield. A kettle called Othrarir held the rest. The names carry heavy weight. Consequently, the craftsmen poured the fluid into Othrarir, a vessel explicitly named for the effect of the impending chemical reaction. The craftsmen processed the raw material immediately. They blended the blood heavily with raw honey. The Prose Edda states that this specific mixture transformed into the Mead of Poetry. Anyone who consumed the dark liquid instantly became a skald. The drinker gained supernatural insight and the absolute mastery of verse. The substance became an object of lethal desire. It triggered a massive chain of thefts and assassinations. Odin eventually stole the entire supply for the highest gods. This narrative initially reads like a hallucinatory fever dream. The imagery is deeply violent and thoroughly unhinged. The underlying structure tells a completely different story. The myth provides a highly specific operational blueprint for prehistoric biotechnology. I review the philological analyses of scholars like Anatoly Lieberman, and the linguistic data points directly to the vat. Saliva causes fermentation. The myth of the god's spit serves as a direct, encoded memory of the communal chewing process. The divine saliva represents the salivary amylase. It functions as the crucial enzymatic starter culture. The dwarf's addition of honey completes the chemical formula. Pure raw honey is an antimicrobial fortress. The high osmotic pressure rips water out of any invading bacteria, killing it instantly. The natural yeast spores trapped inside the golden resin remain completely dormant. The microorganisms sleep in the dense sugar, suspended in time. When the dwarfs introduce the honey to the pre-digested liquid pool of Kvasir's blood, the water content of the environment rises sharply. The osmotic pressure drops. The yeast wakes up. The organisms begin the rapid, violent conversion of the unlocked maltose into ethanol. The scholar Rudolf Simic analyzed the linguistic roots of the murdered god. The Old Norse word kvasir likely referred originally to juice squeezed from berries and left to ferment. Slavic etymology carries the distinct root kvasu. That term designates a sour, leavened beverage. The blood in the myth supplies the dark, oxidized color of a fermented red berry mash. The crushing of kvasir is the pressing of the fruit. The myth presents a massive paradox. The highest cultural product of the Norse world emerges from the lowest biological waste. Spit and blood generate pure wisdom. The modern biochemist sees no paradox at all. Saliva truly catalyzes the reaction. Some modern commentators heavily debate Kvasir's ontological status. Certain social media circles try to reimagine the story as a quaint tale of gods chewing berries for a wine starter. Scholar Hugo Mock even suggested the entire poetic mead narrative might be a later literary invention. The hard biochemical facts anchor the myth in deep antiquity. The chain of transformations maps perfectly onto the physical reality of the brew. God's saliva becomes kvasir. Kvasir becomes blood. Blood mixes with honey to become mead. It is a precise, multi-step biotech pipeline. This biological imperative forced the exact same technology across the globe. Traditional Andean cultures produce chicha de muco using the identical enzymatic trigger. The process is highly ritualized and deeply communal. Women chew maize to a dense pulp. The sustained mastication tires the jaw and requires immense physical endurance. They spit the masticated grain into a communal basin. Natural airborne flora takes over the fermentation once the starch is broken down. The ancient brewers possessed no microscopes. They lacked the vocabulary for microbes or molecular chains. They understood intrinsically that their own bodies wielded a catalytic power. They deployed that power without a single misstep. The first alcohol was forged directly from the tissues and fluids of its makers. Instead of magic, the earliest brewers were simply mixing human spit, crushed berries, and wild honey in the vats. The Neolithic brewers didn't just stumble onto a buzz, they engineered a social operating system. Once you understand the biological trigger of fermentation, our attention now shifts to mapping out how that technology was deployed. Fast forward a few millennia from the primal vats, and that same biological imperative gets wrapped in a heavily sanitized cultural package. You probably think the honeymoon is where romance burns the brightest. Two people in love, a beach, escaping the world. For medieval Europe, it was a harsh, calculated demographic contract. It was drenched in the era's most expensive neurotoxin to ensure the immediate survival of the bloodline. The linguistic trail is completely transparent. The Oxford English Dictionary tracks the term back to the Middle English honeymoon. By 1552, a lexicographer named Richard Hulot recorded the exact phrase in his Abecedarium Anglico-Latinum. He wasn't describing a vacation or a scenic carriage ride. How did a mandatory 30-day prescription of heavily fortified honey liquor and systemic drinking evolve from a demographic contract into a scenic modern vacation? Imagine standing in a damp, timber-framed hall in the 11th century. The political survival of two entire clans hinges on the two terrified teenagers sitting at the high table. They likely met only days ago. The winter is approaching. The harvest yields were thin, and border skirmishes are rapidly draining the local militia. The families standing around them do not cross their fingers and hope for a slow-burning romantic spark. They bring out the vats. So they rolled out the vats, ensuring the terrified couple spent the next 30 days completely intoxicated. The mead delivered a massive, immediate payload of raw fuel. It chemically stripped away the panic of the forced union. The alcohol forced a biological compliance that the political arrangement simply couldn't guarantee on its own. The goal was rapid, guaranteed conception. The drink facilitated this transfer of property and status. Judging by the taxation ledgers from the Baltic networks, I find it impossible to classify mead as a simple agricultural byproduct. We need to understand what honey actually meant before the industrialization of Caribbean sugar. It was the pre-modern world's primary fermentable energy source. Gathering it meant fighting wild swarms in old-growth forests. It meant climbing dead woods, risking massive infection, and absorbing physical trauma just to extract a few pounds of raw comb. To take that hard-won, stable asset of nourishment and let yeast metabolize it was an act of deliberate economic destruction. The resulting mead was exponentially more expensive than any grain-based ale. Beer was the muddy water of the working class. Mead was the hard currency of kings. In the sprawling forests of early Rus in northern Europe, a leader's entire political legitimacy was measured in these vats. You threw a feast, you served the liquid gold. You bought the loyalty of your heavily armed retainers. No honey on the table meant zero respect in the hall. It was a primitive protection racket, and it ran entirely on ethanol. When the Grand Prince held a banquet, the volume of mead consumed served as a public audit of his treasury. His military elite, the Druzhina, demanded this specific liquid payment. They fought for the warlord who provided the strongest, most expensive brew. Accepting the drink formalized their military obligations. The lexicographers at the OED leaned toward a metaphorical explanation for the term, arguing the moon referred to the waning phases of affection. Merriam-Webster points to old proverbs claiming the first month is simply the sweetest. While linguistics confirms the term was a metaphor, the enduring myth points right back to our cultural fixation on the physical vats. The linguistic drift over the centuries is a masterclass in cultural reimagining. A metaphor for fading love merges with the legend of a 30-day prescription of fortified wine, and finally turns into a tropical resort package. The Industrial Revolution eventually made sugar cheap and rail travel possible. The harsh necessity of the original honey contract gradually evolved into a simple consumer product. Voltaire caught the grim reality of the original deal. Writing in his 1747 novel Zadig, he specifically referenced the honey month being inevitably followed by the wormwood month. Therefore, the heavy drinking served only as a temporary primer before the bitter reality of the lifelong contract set in. This brings the investigation right back to the clay sherds in Henan province. The biomolecular data Patrick McGovern extracted at Jiahu showed exactly this hierarchy taking root 9,000 years ago. His mass spectrometry picked up the unmistakable lipid chains of beeswax embedded deep in the ceramic matrix. The Neolithic brewers were already doing the exact same economic math. Rice provided the fermentable bulk. In this 9,000-year-old hierarchy, rice provided the bulk, hawthorn fruit offered the wild yeast, and beeswax lipid chains confirmed the honey. Extracting honey in 7000 BCE required going into the wild without protective mesh or specialized smoke bellows. They endured sheer physical pain for that comb. Dissolving it into a brewing jar demonstrates supreme confidence in the return on investment. They were manufacturing leverage. The paradox of honey is that it universally symbolizes pristine natural purity, yet it was immediately weaponized by early humans into a tool for intoxication and social control. It was the premium additive that elevated a basic fermented gruel into a ritual instrument of power. The entire system points in one definitive direction. Every piece of evidence we have pulled from the historical record shows alcohol acting as the ultimate engine of life. It seals the marriages, it forces the pregnancies, it pays the armies to keep breathing and fighting. It binds the living into functional, expanding societies. Continuous alcohol production was maintained to ensure these societal structures functioned smoothly. The logic seems completely airtight. Alcohol exists to serve the living. But the spatial data from that very first crime scene in Jiahu refuses to play along with this tidy sociological theory. When archaeologists mapped the exact coordinates of the Neolithic pottery within the Jiahu settlement, the most chemically complex brewing vessels weren't found in communal dining spaces or the equivalent of a prehistoric honeymoon suite. They were in the graves. Specifically, they were placed in intimate proximity to the dead, carefully positioned near the mouths and heads of the deceased. The living had taken their most labor-intensive, packing an explosive energy punch, an economically expensive asset, the honey hawthorn rice mead, and intentionally buried it in the dirt. If the honeymoon contract was about using alcohol to force biological reproduction and sustain the living demographic, the grave goods represent something far more insidious. This was the institutionalization of the dead. In the Neolithic mindset, demography did not stop when breathing ceased. The ancestors were still active, voting members of the socio-political hierarchy. They controlled the weather, dictated the crop yields, and determined the outcome of border skirmishes. And just like the warlord's heavily armed Druzhina, The ancestors demanded to be paid in high-proof ethanol.
To understand the sheer economic weight of this practice, you have to look at the raw math of food energy. Pouring gallons of premium honey-spiked liquor into a dark hole is an act of staggering institutional waste. It is the ultimate predatory display of surplus. A society teetering on the edge of starvation does not bury its fermentable calories. By deliberately removing this liquid gold from the biological economy of the living, the ruling class was making a terrifyingly clear statement. We possess so much power, reigning supreme over our environment, that we can afford to let the dead drink better than you. This wasn't a localized Stone Age anomaly. As the centuries rolled forward, this necrotic alcohol economy scaled up into a massive industrial complex. Look at the Shang Dynasty, which ruled the Yellow River Valley some 6,000 years after the Jiahu settlement. The Shang didn't just bury a few clay pots with their elite. They engineered an entire civilization around manufacturing bronze vessels specifically designed to heat, filter, and serve grain wine to royal ghosts. The Anyang excavations revealed a staggering volume of ritual bronzes, ding, jue, and zun, some weighing hundreds of pounds, heavily decorated with the gluttonous Tao Ti beast motif. These massive bronzes functioned directly as the physical infrastructure of an afterlife protection racket. The Shang kings held an iron grip over the peasant class by claiming they were the only ones who could successfully negotiate with the divine heavily armed ancestors. And those negotiations ran strictly on industrial quantities of alcohol. The same mechanism was deployed in Iron Age Europe, proving that the fusion of alcohol, authority, and death is a universal human operating system. In 1977, an amateur archaeologist stumbled across a Celtic burial mound in Hochdorf, Germany, dating back to 530 BCE. When the dirt was peeled back, it revealed a chieftain resting on a bronze couch wearing gold leaf shoes. But the most important object in the tomb wasn't his iron dagger or his gold neck ring. It was a massive imported Greek bronze cauldron. When archaeobotanists scraped the dark residue from the inside of the cauldron, they found the unmistakable chemical signature of honey mixed with meadowsweet and thyme. The cauldron had contained approximately 400 liters of strong mead. 400 liters. That represents millions of wild bees, thousands of hours of dangerous, painful foraging, and a massive agricultural footprint, all fermented, sealed in a metal vault, and permanently removed from circulation. The Hochdorf chieftain wasn't just taking a drink to the afterlife, he was taking an entire localized economy. The sheer volume of mead acted as a geopolitical anchor from beyond the grave. Could a deeply entrenched ghost effectively wage demographic warfare against rival Celtic clans simply through the sheer volume of post-mortem hospitality? If this elixir was simply a tool for the living, one would expect to find the vessels in residential areas, or the Neolithic equivalent. You look for communal hearths. You trace the dirt paths between the houses to find the ancient dining halls. Archaeologists did exactly this. They mapped out the precise coordinates of those 9,000-year-old clay jars in the Yellow River Valley. They mapped the settlement in Henan province grid by tedious grid. The physical evidence dragged the archaeologists away from the hearth fires of the residential zones and pointed directly into the cemetery. Every single intact vessel holding that extreme hybrid cocktail was pulled out of a burial pit. They were tucked right next to the skeletons. The researchers found a systemic rerouting of the village's entire agricultural surplus. The sheer volume of pottery required to hold this liquid implies a massive, organized diversion of labor. As a result, the village diverted all the massive labor required to make, fire, and seal the heavy clay vats directly into the burial shafts. We are looking at a highly deliberate drop. The chemical Patrick McGovern's mass spectrometry results didn't just find stray accidental grain, they found tartaric acid.
That is the definitive biomarker for grapes and hawthorn fruit. They found the molecular ghost of beeswax. They found the broken-down starches of cultivated rice, which McGovern famously dubbed the resulting liquid a Neolithic Grog. It was a fermented, unfiltered multi-fruit and grain mash. These early brewers didn't have pure isolated yeast strains in foil packets. The wild microflora sitting on the fruit skins did all the heavy lifting. Once the fermentation process was complete, they took these pots of high-gravity alcohol and placed them directly into the dirt alongside the corpses. They even left whole fruit pits scattered around the vessels in the earth. This forces a complete rewrite of the motive. The Jiahu site constantly gets billed in the press as the earliest chemically confirmed complex alcoholic beverage in the world, but it actually fits a darker, much older pattern. If you look at the Natufian burials in Racket Cave in Israel roughly 13,000 years ago, you find traces of a primitive beer wort that was also carved into a grave. The first structured, systematic brewing operations in human history bypassed the living entirely and were engineered specifically to be poured into the graves. Look at the spatial layout of the Jiahu necropolis itself. The graves are not democratic. The distribution of the alcohol jars creates a distinct, silent map of Neolithic status. Certain clusters of tombs, likely representing specific dominant clans or elites, received the heavy liquid offerings. Others got nothing but dirt. The archaeologists found delicate crane bone flutes buried right alongside the vats of grog. You can almost reconstruct the sensory overload of the funeral. The sharp, yeasty smell of the active fermentation rising from the jars. That sweet, acidic odor masking the smell of the corpse. The shrill, piercing sound of the flutes echoing over the open pits. The bone flute stopped playing, and the dirt was shoveled back in.
This was not a localized fluke that eventually died out.
This specific ritual established a rigid blueprint. It governed Chinese culture for the next several millennia. The jars in Jiahu are the direct ancestors of the massive bronze cups of rice wine placed in Han Dynasty tombs thousands of years later. They are the theological foundation for the modern practice of pouring high-proof baijiu on the ground for the spirits. In 2003, excavators working a tomb in Xi'an popped the lid off a sealed bronze vessel. Inside, they found liters of a yellowish liquid still surviving after centuries in the dark. It was rice wine. It was placed there for a ghost. The ancient rule allowed no exceptions. The dead drink first.
Faced with the sheer volume of ceramic containers dedicated to the cemetery,
I conclude the brewing cycle was entirely synchronized with the funerary cycle. They didn't just keep a vat bubbling in the corner of a hut for casual daily use. They likely brewed massive, resource-draining batches for a specific terminal moment. A final communal feast right at the edge of the grave. The living gathered around the open pit. They consumed a portion of the raw, aggressive brew to enter an altered, receptive state. Then, the rest of the batch followed the deceased into the ground. The alcohol physically dissolved the boundary between the living breath of the tribe and the rotting flesh of the departed. The jars remained at the bottom of the pit.
There is a strange irony in the modern archaeological record. The chemical analysis captures the alcohol perfectly inside the tombs, but gives us almost zero data on daily casual consumption. When a modern drinker orders a pint, they expect a temporary escape from their reality. When a Neolithic mourner sealed a jar of grog into the dirt, they expected a permanent alliance. The scent of the fermenting mash represented the tangible presence of the ancestors sitting at the table. Modern craft breweries have actually partnered with researchers to resurrect this exact recipe. You can buy a commercial version of the Jiahu brew today. People drink it at brightly lit bars completely divorced from its original subterranean purpose. They think they are tasting the dawn of agriculture. They pay their tab and go home. And that brings us back to the great caloric paradox of the Stone Age we started with. Why did starving, desperate farmers burn their most precious, hard-won resources to make a neurotoxin?
Why did they waste the rice and the honey? This massive caloric expenditure served as the ultimate tax bracket, where the living were paying protection money to the dead. The first drop of alcohol was never meant for us.